Then we're going to look at how to do some repeating of rows inside of Angular. And this is where we might have an array and we want to loop through it and display each element in that array. And there's a directive that can accomplish that called ng-repeat. So we're going to see how to do that. But before we do, we're actually going to use it in conjunction with retrieving some data off of the web. So let's check out a website. This is actually going to be on GitHub. And what I want to do is just access this directly. And the output is going to be JSON. So I'm going to go to API, github.com, and I want to do users, and I'm just going to go for someone in particular here. And you can see here it's actually getting the JSON, and this is what we get. So it's just a string basically of JSON. And it's got attributes for this particular user. So what we're going to do is retrieve that data, and then we can loop through the information that comes from it. And I'm going to set this up using a table, just a regular HTML table in the UI. Before we get into looping through this data, let's just make sure we can retrieve something simple, maybe the user's name. So we're going to have some Angular here, and I am going to fill this in just a little bit, but we need to add our supporting structure for this. And I am just going to add that code right above our other function. So what I'm going to do is attach a function that we can call from Angular. And this is something we've done before. So this is the function right here that's going to be going back into Angular. And the function definition is what I'm creating now. So I want a response, and then in here I want to actually do the retrieval of the data. So I'm going to use our HTTP service, and I'm going to do a get, because that's the kind of retrieval that we're going to be doing. And this is going to be an HTTPS, and I'll do api.github.com users, and I'll just do this user's name. And then I need to do the processing of that user. So I'm going to say then on complete. And actually I'm going to do find complete. This is like a little familiar with event handling in .NET. So whenever this finishes, it's going to call this on find complete. And now I'll close that. I'll add a semicolon here. And now we need to create our on find complete. So I'll create a variable, because this is not something we need to send back to the UI. And I can just copy this. It's just something that's going to be used right here inside of Angular. And so I need to create another function. Response. And then in here is where I'm going to assign to a model that's going to get used in the UI. So that's going to be user response data. And now I need to add a semicolon, and I need to define this in the UI so that we gain access to it. So here in the UI, we are going to have our user, and I'll do user.name. And we can try this. I'm going to save. I'm going to have to compile this. Restart our project. All right, and here's our name. And I probably should have put a break, a line break right there, to see what would happen with that. And I actually need another button here so that we can trigger this. So I'm going to fix that in our view and just add a line break. And then here I'll add a button, another button. So this one's going to trigger the find it method. And I'm going to just do a regular button. and then I'll do an ng click. And this is going to be familiar to what we did with our submit, where we did ng click equals update, and update is our Angular function. So here we're going to reference another function. And you can see we're getting some pretty nice IntelliSense off of this as well. But this function here is going to be find it. I'll close that and I'll just do find name. And I'll add a line break here. And before we run this, actually you have a misspelling there that would cause issues. All right, and so let's see what happens. And now if I click find name, and we get our name back. So we look at this, name is just one of the components inside of that big long JSON string that we were looking at. All right, so now we can go ahead and get into creating our table. I'm just going to add a paragraph tag here. And now I'll add our table. And this is going to be our table row. And on here, I'm going to introduce the ng repeat. And this is going to allow us to loop and create, it's basically like a template in ASP.NET Web Forms. And inside of here, we'll define our actual cell, and then we can, anything inside the cell, we can reference, and it's basically going to get repeated and create new cells. And this is also going to create a new row for each entry. So I want to do user in all users. All users is another variable that we're going to assign data to, and then we're going to pull a user out on each iteration of all users. Now I'll close that. Not that, I want table row. And in here I'm going to do same thing we did above. User name. Now in our Angular code, I need to go ahead and get these users out and assign them to this all users variable. Then we can loop through them. And on here is basically where I want to do it. So this is everything, and I am going to pull users out of this. And to do that, it's basically going to look like this. So after the UI gets assigned, I can still make use of this response data. And I'm going to use our HTTP service. I'll do another get, and this is going to be scope user repost URL. When that comes back, I want to do on find all complete. So I'm just kind of following the pattern from earlier and getting us another event body here. And then I need to define this. So I'm just going to copy this like that. Create another function for it. Semicolon. And then I want to do an assignment of all users. So all users will equal response.data. Okay. So here's what's happening. First, we go through our find it triggered by the UI. So that kicks this off, and when that finishes, it's going to call this function here, which is this one here, defined here. And that is going to send in our response, and in our response, we're going to go ahead and access our data and assign it to our Angular model called user, which we display in the UI. Then we keep going. We do another call to this repository URL that comes off of user. So this is going to be a URL, one of the JSON components inside of user. And when that call finishes, we go ahead and call another function, which we define here. Or actually, this is where we're going to create the reference, and then we define it here. We pass in our data, and in our data, our response, we access all of these users and we'll assign them. So this is going to be a lot of JSON going into here that ng repeat will be able to then access and loop through. So we're about to see what that looks like. This right here, earlier I had response in there, which is not needed because we're not sending anything into that function called find it. So you can see here it's just an empty parameter list, unlike what we did up here where we actually needed the parameter. So I just went ahead and removed response from here. It wasn't needed. Okay, so let's go ahead and give that a try. That should theoretically work. We're about to find out though. And I'm going to allow this to compile and run now. And find name. So it looks like we still have our one user right there, but we're not getting back all of our data. So let's look at our code behind here in Angular. Let me see, we have on all find all, we got our function. I see. Looks like a misspelling right there. And one other issue is I am not using a scoped variable here, so I had the $sign on the response. And now I'm going to save this and just refresh, find name, and there we go. So there's our full listing. That's a single column table and outputting out these various users. And just to kind of cover how this works and what we did here, and I can go ahead and remove this border one. And so we created a table. We did this ng repeat where we have some array, which is all users, and we pull out a user. So this is similar to some C# for each syntax where we iterate through some loop and then we name a variable that we can pull out. So we're not using an index here where we just walk through and go by number of element in the array. And then we access that element and properties on the element. So this name right here is a component inside of the JSON coming back. This is basically a template, this cell right here. So by assigning to this variable from here, we're able to create that enumeration. And the way it works is that we go ahead and we pull back the user info here, and then we say once that is complete, because it will take a little bit of time to go out and get that and fetch it, we add a method that we want to fire on complete, which is this here. So this is the reference that we created. Then we assign this function to this right here. Now you could have likely just taken all this function and put it here. That gets to be a little bit more difficult to read. So we just created this reference and then we built our function. The response is actually the data that comes back from this. And then we access the JSON inside of the response and assign it to user. And user now has that big JSON string, and we pull out another part of that, the repository URL, and go get it. Basically the same as what we're doing here. Going out to the internet, we get something, and it will come back after a little while. And then we say, once you do come back, fire this method, which we create a reference to it here. It's a simple function. And again, we pass in our result and we access this array that is on it and assign it to our users. And that's basically how it works. So here in this lesson, we saw how we can go and get something off the internet or have a function do something that might take a little bit of time. And once that finishes, we can do a then and then point to another function that triggers once that is complete. So it's a fairly compact bit of syntax to set this up, and you can see it's not difficult to read exactly what's going on with that. Pretty maintainable as well.